Thanksgiving was always a big deal at my aunt's house. She loved the holiday, cooking up an extravagant feast, pulling out the fancy china, and gathering the whole family around the massive dining table in her old Victorian home. But there was one tradition that always gave me chills: setting a place for the forgotten guest. No one ever explained it properly. When I was a kid, I asked why there was an empty chair and a full plate at the table. My aunt would just smile and say, "It's tradition. The forgotten guest must always have a place." That was it. I shrugged it off as some quirky family custom. This year, the tradition felt different. The atmosphere around the table was heavy, almost stifling. Everyone seemed tense, even my aunt, who was usually the life of the party. Still, we laughed and ate, clinking glasses and sharing stories. The empty chair sat at the end of the table, untouched, its plate piled high with food. As the night went on, we started hearing odd noises: the creak of footsteps upstairs, the faint sound of a door closing. My cousin joked that the old house was settling, but I could tell no one believed him. Then, at exactly 11:11 p.m., the doorbell rang. We all froze. No one was expecting anyone. The street outside was dark and silent, the kind of quiet you don't want to disturb. My aunt hesitated, her face pale, before finally getting up to answer it. When she opened the door, there was a man standing there. At least, I think it was a man. He was pale, almost translucent, with eyes that seemed too deep, like they could pull you in. He didn't say a word. My aunt just nodded, stepped aside, and let him in. He walked straight to the empty chair, sat down, and folded his hands neatly in his lap. Everyone stared, but no one dared speak. My aunt resumed her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up her glass of wine. For the next 10 minutes, we sat in silence. The man didn't eat, didn't move, just sat there, staring at the food in front of him. The air in the room grew colder, and I could see my breath puffing out in little clouds. Finally, he stood up. Slowly, he turned to face us, his deep, empty eyes sweeping over the table. When his gaze landed on me, my heart felt like it stopped. He nodded once, a gesture of approval, gratitude. I couldn't tell. Then he turned and walked out the front door, disappearing into the night. No one said a word after he left. My aunt quietly cleared the plate and chair, her hands shaking as she placed them back in the kitchen. That night, I asked her who, or what, the forgotten guest was. She didn't answer. She just whispered, "He comes to remind us not to forget." Forget what? I never found out. But every Thanksgiving since, I've noticed the chair, the plate, and the food. And I've never been brave enough to ask more. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and I was running late. I hadn't planned ahead, and every grocery store in town was a madhouse. On my way home, I noticed a small roadside stand I'd never seen before just off the main road. A hand-painted sign read, "Farm Fresh Organic Turkeys." I figured it was my lucky break. The farmer was an odd man, older, with piercing eyes that seemed to look right through me. When I asked about the turkeys, he simply gestured to a cooler behind him. I picked one out, paid in cash, and as I was leaving, he muttered, almost under his breath, "Treat it with respect." It was a weird comment, but I brushed it off. By the time I got home, it was already dark. I unpacked the turkey and began prepping it. It was enormous and oddly heavier than I'd expected. As I seasoned it, I noticed what looked like faint scratch marks on its skin, almost like claw marks. I told myself it was just my imagination and kept going. The strange thing started almost immediately after I put the turkey in the oven. I was sitting in the living room when I heard a faint thud from the kitchen. I froze, listening. A moment later, I heard it again, this time louder. When I went to check, nothing was out of place. The oven was humming away, and the kitchen was quiet. But as I turned to leave, I swear I heard a whisper. It was faint, like someone speaking from inside the oven. My skin prickled, but I shook it off, convincing myself it was just the heat making weird noises. Back in the living room, I tried to relax, but something felt off. The air was heavier, and it felt like someone was watching me. I turned to look at the dining room and froze. In the dim light, I saw a shadow move across the room. It wasn't my shadow. I wasn't standing anywhere near the light. My heart raced as I stepped closer, but the room was empty. I laughed nervously to myself and decided I was just overreacting. When the timer went off, I was relieved. The turkey was done, and I could finally stop thinking about all the weirdness. But as I opened the oven door, the smell hit me, burnt and rancid, nothing like the delicious aroma I'd been expecting. I looked down at the turkey, and it moved. Just a twitch, almost like a muscle spasm. I slammed the oven door shut and backed away. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe the heat caused something to contract. Yeah, that had to be it. But then the whispers started again, clearer this time. Words I couldn't understand, but they came from all around me, filling the room. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. The shadowy figure standing in the corner of the dining room, its head tilted unnaturally, like it was watching me. I bolted out of the house and spent the night at a friend's place. The next morning, I returned to find the turkey gone. The pan was empty, and the oven door was wide open. I've never bought anything from a roadside stand again, and every Thanksgiving since, I stick to vegetables. It all started with what seemed like a harmless tradition, camping out for Black Friday deals. My friends and I had done this for years. The rush of hunting for discounts and the camaraderie of surviving the chaos together made it an annual highlight. But this time, it went horribly wrong. We arrived at the mall around midnight, folding chairs and thermoses in hand. The line was already long, stretching around the building. The air buzzed with energy as people shared tips, swapped stories, and debated the best deals. By 5 a.m., the doors opened, and the floodgates unleashed a wave of frantic shoppers. The first hour inside felt normal: crowded aisles, overflowing carts, and heated arguments over TVs and game consoles. Then something shifted. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when we noticed, but the store seemed bigger. We turned a corner to find rows of shelves stretching endlessly into the distance, far longer than the layout we'd memorized from previous years. "We must have taken a wrong turn," I said, trying to sound confident. We retraced our steps, but every aisle looked the same. The store's usual background music had stopped, replaced by a faint, distant hum. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the towering shelves. And then we saw them. At first, they seemed like other shoppers, people moving in the distance. But as they got closer, their movements were jerky, unnatural. Their faces were pale and emotionless, with dark, sunken eyes. One of them clutched a shopping bag filled with nothing but crumpled receipts. "They've been here too long," one of my friends whispered, his voice shaking. Panic set in as we realized there were no exits. Every door led back into the mall. We ran past stores we didn't recognize, their displays filled with bizarre, outdated items: rotary phones, powdered wigs, typewriters. Time didn't seem to exist here. The zombie-like shoppers began to notice us. They didn't run or lunge, but shuffled closer, their vacant eyes locked onto us. A chilling whisper echoed through the air: "Stay forever." One by one, my friends started to vanish. I turned to look for them, and they were simply gone, swallowed by the endless aisles. Finally, I found myself alone in a vast, empty food court. The tables were littered with untouched meals, the smell of decay heavy in the air. Desperately, I screamed, "Where is the exit?" A voice responded, low and guttural. "There is no exit. Only deals. Endless deals." Suddenly, the lights went out. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me in the darkness. I ran blindly, tripping over unseen obstacles until I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. And then, I woke up. I was in the parking lot, my friends standing beside me, their faces pale and drawn. None of us said a word as we silently packed up and drove away. We never camped out for Black Friday again. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that voice in my head. Stay. Forever. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. The warmth of family, the smell of spiced cider, and the comfort of traditions. That year, I decided to shake things up and accept an invitation from a coworker, Tom, to visit his small hometown for their annual Thanksgiving Harvest Festival. The festival was charming at first, a quaint, bustling celebration of local traditions, booths selling handmade crafts, live folk music, and children running around with sticky candied apples. Tom spoke glowingly about how the festival was the backbone of their town's prosperity, bringing bountiful harvests and economic stability year after year. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere shifted. Townsfolk began whispering about the midnight ritual in the cornfield, an unmissable event. Intrigued, I pressed Tom for details, but his response was vague. He simply said, "You'll understand when you see it." Curiosity got the better of me, so I joined the procession of townspeople making their way to the edge of the vast cornfield under a pale, glowing moon. The air was thick with anticipation, and an eerie silence fell over the crowd as they gathered in a perfect circle. At the center stood an altar, constructed from twisted wood and crowned with corn husks and dried leaves. A tall figure in ceremonial robes, their face obscured by a harvest mask, stepped forward. They raised their arms, and the crowd began to chant in unison. It was then that I noticed something odd. No one else from outside the town was there. I was the only newcomer. The chanting grew louder, echoing off the stalks of corn. Suddenly, the figure on the altar pointed directly at me. The crowd parted, and I felt hands guiding me toward the center. My protests were drowned out by the deafening chants. Tom appeared at my side, his expression one of guilt and desperation. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "This is how we keep the town alive. The harvest requires a sacrifice." Before I could react, the chanting stopped, replaced by an unnatural stillness. The cornfield seemed to shudder, and from its depths emerged something inhuman. It was a mass of writhing roots and husks, its eyes glowing like embers. It reached out with gnarled limbs, its presence ancient and malevolent. Panicked, I broke free and ran, shoving my way through the stunned crowd. Behind me, the chants resumed, louder and more frenzied. The creature roared, a sound that seemed to shake the earth itself. I didn't look back until I was far from the town. I never saw Tom again. Weeks later, I looked up the town online, only to find no mention of its existence. It was as if it had been swallowed whole, erased from every map. To this day, the smell of spiced cider and the rustle of corn stalks send chills down my spine. Whatever I had witnessed that night, it wasn't something meant for outsiders, and it certainly wasn't something I'll ever forget.